When I asked why he gave his relatives a family card, Stephen threw his head back and laughed, as if he had heard something obvious, as if the reason was so simple that it did not even require an explanation. Of course, because they're my family, he said with confidence, and there was lightness in his voice, even perhaps a hint of reproach. Of course, they must have a family card, right? I felt his calm confidence fill the room, as something smug appeared in his tone, making me tense inwardly. It was a note that I hadn't noticed before or didn't want to notice, but now it sounded so obvious that it was impossible to ignore it. Noticing my surprise, Stephen continued, no longer laughing, but with the same shade of complacency that I was becoming less and less pleased with. Do you have a problem with that? I wanted to answer, but he beat me to it, sighed, looked straight into my eyes, and said, a little more softly, but still with the same confident urgency. If you knew who sheltered you when you were all alone, you wouldn't say such things. You would have understood. This unexpected turn in the conversation took me by surprise. I did not expect such a direct tone from Stephen, who previously seemed to me much softer, more restrained, less demanding. If you're really grateful for everything, he continued, and his words seemed to hang in the air, accumulating a weight that I felt with every cell of my body, then you should do more for my family. I felt a rush of heat. Something inside me tightened, but I didn't immediately understand what it was. It wasn't just surprise, it was a deep, underlying, barely perceptible feeling that I suddenly found myself not where I should be, that the ground under my feet turned out to be alien, shaky. Then I can consider you part of the family, he added almost casually. But for now it's like you're on probation. Probation period. I've never heard such an expression in the context of marriage. Probation period. Those words rang in my head like a broken glass shattering into hundreds of sharp shards. I looked up at him, but Stephen was looking at me calmly, even slightly scrutinizing, as if checking if I understood. If you don't like it, he said with a shrug, you can leave at any time. So far, our family consists of only 6 people. It was like an icy wind rushing down my back. Those words burned me with their cold emotionlessness. I felt numb, like a sudden blow. Something broke in me. The idea that I was on probation in my own marriage was so absurd that it seemed like a ridiculous dream. A wave of bewilderment swept over me, and then anger. I looked at Stephen, but in front of me was no longer the man I once loved. The words were difficult to come out because I suddenly realized that in front of me stood a man for whom my love, my trust, my presence in his life were something like a deal, the terms of which he considered it possible to renegotiate. As soon as he stopped talking, I made a decision. I left the room, went up to the bedroom, took out my laptop, logged into the online bank and canceled all our joint credit cards. Then she packed her suitcase. I moved out of our house that evening. My name is Olivia Cook. I'm 30 years old. I am a freelancer and illustrator. I used to work as a designer for a large advertising agency, but 5 years ago, after getting married, I decided to leave and start working on my own. It seemed to me then that it was a convenient choice. Now it seemed to me that it was a mistake. My parents died when I was a child. They died in an accident, and since then I have been raised by my maternal grandparents. When they were gone, I returned to my parents' apartment near the city center to study at college, and have lived there ever since. That's when I met Stephen. We met in a small Italian restaurant where he worked as a waiter. It was a cozy place with good cuisine and affordable prices, and my colleagues and I often went there after work. Stephen immediately attracted attention to himself, tall, confident, with a pleasant smile and impeccable manners. He knew how to win over people as if each of them was special to him. I've seen many visitors come there over and over again just to meet him. And I became one of them too. I can't deny there was something about him that made me forget about time, want to hear his voice, see his smile. Then it seemed to me that this was love. I continued to work as an illustrator, but now on my own terms, without a strict schedule, without pressure from my superiors. Stephen continued to work in the restaurant, His shifts were chaotic, sometimes lasting well into the night, and although we didn't see each other as often as I would have liked, I told myself that this was normal. That it's temporary. That everything will get better. But every day is strange, the elusive feeling of anxiety grew inside me. And now, sitting in my parents' apartment, among the things that remembered me as a child, I was thinking about only one thing. Why didn't I see this before? I stood in the doorway, feeling tension slowly but inexorably building up inside me, as if something invisible but palpably heavy was pressing down on my chest, preventing me from taking a deep breath. Stephen's sister was looking at me, her lips curled into a casual grin, and there was something in her gaze that I didn't like, too confident, too domineering, as if she had already decided for me how things would be in this house. I looked at Stephen, hoping to see at least some understanding, some support in his eyes, but instead I saw his grin, the one that always seemed so charming to me, but now it was filled with something unpleasant, almost mocking, as if I were a small child indignant at its nothing. Are you serious? I barely managed to get these words out of myself, although everything inside was boiling, seething, and wanted to pour out into a torrent of indignation. But I restrained myself because I didn't want to make a scene in front of his family. I didn't want to show my weakness in front of these people who, apparently, had already decided that my house now belongs to them too. Stephen just shrugged his shoulders, as if everything that was happening was completely natural, as if I was the only one who didn't understand that this was how it should be. Of course, it's serious, his sister said, not waiting for his answer, her voice sounding as if everything had already been decided, as if I was the one who was late with my question. Now we all live together, which means we have to take care of each other. You're Stephen's wife, and a wife should be able to take care of her husband's family. These words sounded as if I was automatically obligated by the fact of our marriage to obey their rules, as if this house, which had once been my refuge, my personal territory, had now become something like a dormitory in which I was only one of the inhabitants, and even with additional responsibilities. I looked at Stephen, hoping to hear at least some kind of objection from him, at least one attempt to explain to me that this was all some kind of joke or misunderstanding, but he was silent, and his silence said much more than any words. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, even though indignation was already burning inside me. Okay, I said slowly, let's first define what it means to take proper care. Stephen's sister grinned, her self-satisfaction almost palpable. Well, of course, you will take care of the house, cook, clean, make sure that everyone is comfortable. It's natural, isn't it? I exhaled sharply, feeling my fingers clench into fists. You've come to visit, I said, trying to keep my voice level, even though anger was already bubbling inside. Not to a boarding house with a staff. Stephen chuckled, and that chuckle threw me off balance more than anything I'd said before. I turned to him, feeling a storm rising in me. Do you really think that's okay? I almost hissed, barely restraining myself from screaming. He shrugged again, his expression completely calm, even bored. Olivia, they're my family, he said, as if that explained everything. And at that moment, I suddenly realized that the man I married, whom I considered my partner, was not who I imagined him to be. Or maybe he's always been like this, but I just didn't want to notice it. This thought hit me with such force that for a moment I felt stunned. So you don't see a problem with that? My voice sounded quiet, but there was so much tension in it that even Stephen's younger sister, who had been standing silently up to that moment, hunched her shoulders and took a step back. Stephen sighed, as if I were boring him with my stubbornness. I don't see a problem with my family feeling at home here, he said slowly, as if explaining something self-evident. I was looking at him, and at that moment, an invisible wall seemed to grow between us, separating us into two completely different realities. Okay, I said, feeling something break inside me, like what I had been building for so long, what I so desperately believed in, was crumbling. Then maybe I should start feeling like a guest here, too. I turned around and left the room, leaving them behind. I heard Stephen's sister say something to him in a low voice, and I heard his soft laughter, but I no longer tried to listen to their conversation. Everything was clear without words. I locked myself in the bedroom, sat on the bed and looked at the suitcase in the corner of the room. Inside, something cold and sticky rose from the depths, filling me with a feeling that could be called despair, if not for one, but I no longer wanted to fight. I was not a naive girl who expected that the world would always be fair, but even I could not foresee that I would find myself in a situation where my own home would become a place where I no longer belong. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. I didn't know what I was going to do yet, but one thing was clear: it wouldn't be the way it was before. The days merged into an endless series of identical scenes, where, like a maid in my own house, I performed duties that no one assigned to me, but which fell on my shoulders by default, because no one else was going to do them, and this whole situation, which at first seemed to me only a temporary inconvenience, gradually became a new one. A reality in which my opinion played no role, and my kindness turned against me like a trap set by a skilled hunter. I got up before everyone else to make breakfast, because if I didn't, no one even thought about getting out of bed and taking over this duty. But as soon as food appeared on the table, Stephen's whole family became animated. They left their rooms, sat down at the table and ate, without even deigning to me. With gratitude, as if I was just doing my job, like a hotel attendant, and after breakfast they would calmly go about their business, leaving dirty dishes behind, as if this was also something self-evident, and when I tried to hint, it wouldn't hurt to clean up after herself, Stephen's older sister just chuckled condescendingly, looking at me as if I'd said something ridiculous, and then, lazily stretching, declared that she needed to rest after a hard morning, which, by the way, she spent in bed, flipping through the tape on her phone. And this was repeated day after day, the mess that no one but me cleaned up, the indifference with which I was perceived, and the constant feeling that I was not living in my own house, but in some kind of dormitory, where I was assigned the role of a servant, because, apparently, that's how it is. I was perceived by these people, who once seemed to me just my husband's family, but now they became strangers to me, brazenly invading my life and not feeling a bit awkward about it. But the most painful thing about this whole situation was that Stephen, the man I once loved, who was my rock and support, didn't just turn a blind eye to all this, but didn't even seem to notice that something abnormal was happening, because every time I tried to talk to him when, having gathered all my determination, I tried to explain that it couldn't go on like this, he just sighed tiredly, said that I was exaggerating, that they were just getting used to a new place, and if I showed a little patience, everything would get better, but there was no softness in his voice. What was before, I didn't see understanding in his eyes, and more often I caught myself thinking that maybe he had always been like this, I just didn't notice it or didn't want to notice it. But the most humiliating moment was the morning when, waking up earlier than usual, I heard voices from the kitchen and, coming closer, froze on the threshold, because I saw Stephen's older sister sitting at the table, lazily fingering my earrings, the ones that I inherited from my mother, and talking carelessly that it would be nice if I gave them to her, because they look better on her than on me, and Stephen, who was sitting across from her, didn't even try to reason with her, but just grinned and said that I hardly wear them anyway, so I'm not sorry, and this time the moment I understood that this was no longer just a temporary inconvenience, not just a family disagreement, but something more, something that went beyond my understanding, because if the person I considered my ally could so easily betray my feelings, so disparage what was of great importance to me, then he was no longer the Stephen the first married. I entered the kitchen, not hiding my anger or pain, took the earrings from his sister's hands and, squeezing them in my palms so that my nails dug into my skin, looked at Stephen, hoping to see at least a shadow of remorse, but he just shrugged his shoulders and, as if apologizing for me to his family, said, "Well, Olivia is being dramatic again," and this moment was the last straw for me, because I suddenly realized that I was no longer his wife or partner, but just a person with whom he shares a living space, a person whose opinion no longer means anything. I didn't say a word, just turned around and went into the bedroom, but a hurricane of thoughts was already boiling inside me, because if before I still hoped that I could change something with patience and gentleness, now I realized that all this was an illusion, that my kindness only gave them a reason to use me, that my concessions were perceived not as a gesture of goodwill, but as my duty, and the longer I let this continue, the harder it will be for me to get out of this trap into which I drove myself, trying to be a good wife, a good hostess, a good person. And at that moment, I made a decision. I won't tolerate it anymore. I won't let them treat me like a servant in my own house anymore. And if Stephen doesn't want to see problems, if he chose his family's side over mine, then I won't try to fight for him anymore. Because a person who truly loves you won't let you feel like a stranger in your own home. I took a deep breath, trying to calm down, but something had already changed inside me, something that couldn't be turned back. I remembered Stephen laughing with everyone at that moment, but his eyes flashed with a strange gleam that I couldn't decipher at the time, and now, looking back, I realized that even then he saw in me not just a girl with whom to build a relationship, but a convenient option, an opportunity to solve his financial problems at my expense, and perhaps this explained his extraordinary persistence at the very beginning of our acquaintance, his desire to impress, his courtship, which seemed sincere to me at the time, but now looked like a carefully thought-out game, in which he must have known exactly what role I was going to play. I was overcome by a wave of disgust for him, for his family, but most of all for myself, because I allowed this to happen. I turned a blind eye to obvious things, justified his inaction, forgave what I should never have forgiven, and all for what? For the sake of the man who was now telling me that I was on probation in my own family? I looked back at Stephen, who now seemed like a complete stranger to me. He was no longer the person I once loved, whom I considered my partner, my support. No, now I was facing a calculating, cold-blooded manipulator who saw in me nothing but a convenient resource, and my only mistake was that I realized it too late. A thought began to form in my head, weak at first, almost imperceptible, but with every second it gained strength, turning into a clear and understandable decision. I had to leave. And not just to leave, but to do it so that I would never see him or his family again, in order to uproot them from my life, without a chance to return. I knew that if I told him about this now, he would either try to change my mind using his favorite tactic of alternating aggression and deceitful kindness, or, even worse, he simply wouldn't take me seriously, because in his head I was something like a thing he was used to using, and things don't go away on their own. They're either thrown away or continue to be used until they finally break down. So I didn't say anything. I wasn't going to give him any chance to prepare for my departure. I had to do everything quickly, unnoticeably, and as efficiently as possible, because if he realized that I was going to leave, he would do everything to stop me, maybe not physically, but psychologically for sure. I spent the next few days in absolute silence, trying not to attract attention to myself, not to arouse suspicion. I still performed all the duties that were assigned to me, I still smiled when I needed to smile, and I answered with short, neutral phrases when I was spoken to. But inside me, I no longer had the suppressed anger that I had before. There was no pain or disappointment, just a cold, clear determination. At night, when the whole house was asleep, would quietly pack my things, taking away only the most necessary things, documents, money, jewelry that were of special value to me, some clothes. I couldn't take too much. If someone noticed that my things were missing, it would raise questions, and I couldn't afford to fail. On the third day, I found a lawyer. I chose it carefully, contacting one of the most prestigious firms, where they did not ask unnecessary questions and knew how to act quickly. Divorce is always difficult, but in my situation it had to go as smoothly as possible. I asked them to prepare the papers without notifying Stephen, without prior conversations, just to put him in front of the fact when I was already far away. When everything was ready, I chose the night to escape. I knew that his family usually went to bed late, but after 1 o'clock in the morning, the house was quiet. I waited for this moment, holding my breath, then slowly, noiselessly left the bedroom, holding in my hands a small bag containing all the most important things. But when I got to the front door, I heard a voice. "Are you going to leave?" I froze. Stephen's younger sister was standing in the semi-darkness of the hallway, arms crossed over her chest and looking at me mockingly. There was no surprise in her voice, just outright gloating. "Do you think we didn't know?" She continued, cocking her head slightly to one side. "Do you think Stephen hasn't noticed that you're acting weird?" I felt panic building up inside me, but I immediately suppressed it. I couldn't let her see my fear. "Step back," I said calmly. But she didn't budge, just grinned wider. What if I tell the others? Do you think they'll just let you go? She wasn't bluffing. If she wakes Stephen up, if she wakes my parents up, they won't just let me go. They will do everything to make me stay. Tell me, I suddenly said softly, looking her straight in the eye. Tell them. Let them come. Let's see which one of us turns out to be stronger. Her smile faltered. She hadn't expected this. I didn't expect that I wouldn't start making excuses, begging her to keep quiet, and I wouldn't be afraid. I took a step forward, forcing her to step back. Do you think I'll be afraid of you forever? I whispered, moving closer to her with each word. Do you think you can just take my life? She took another step back, then another. You have no right. I interrupted. And I'm leaving. Right now. She paused, pursed her lips, then abruptly turned around and disappeared into the darkness of the corridor. I didn't wait for her to change her mind, but quickly turned around, turned the key in the lock, and stepped out the door without turning around. I watched as Stephen's family's greed grew day by day, as they increasingly felt like the owners of an apartment that rightfully belonged only to me, and this realization corroded me from the inside out, generating anger, cold and calculating, which I directed not at senseless outbursts of emotion, but at creating a detailed escape plan. From these people who took over my life, who turned my house into a comfortable shelter in which they could live on everything ready-made, without making the slightest effort. I understood that a direct conflict would not lead to anything good. Stephen and his family were masters of manipulation. They knew how to make me feel guilty, not appreciating their care, and I knew that if I just demanded that they leave, it would turn into endless tears, reproaches, blackmail, and possibly even with threats, because people who are used to living at someone else's expense rarely give up such a comfortable life voluntarily. So I decided to play their game, but on my own terms. The first thing I did was start controlling my finances with as much care as I had ever done before. I closed those credit cards that Stephen's family knew about and transferred all the money to a new account at another bank, leaving just enough on the old one so that it didn't seem suspiciously empty, but at the same time didn't give them the opportunity to spend so much like they used to. At the same time, I began to behave in such a way that no one would have a shadow of doubt that I was still a submissive, comfortable wife who was unaware of what was happening around her. I still cooked dinners for them. I still smiled when one of them started a conversation. I agreed with their complaints about life and even nodded in response to ridiculous remarks that I was incredibly lucky to live with such a friendly family, and not a single muscle twitched. My face when Stephen's sister started talking again about how the apartment was too big for me alone and that it might be logical to transfer part of the property to Stephen, because he was still the husband and head of the family. At that moment, I wanted to laugh. Not from joy, but from the absurdity of the situation, from how brazenly and self-confidently they were building their web, unaware that I had been preparing a knife for a long time that would cut through all their plans in one moment. But I continued to play my role, patiently waiting for the moment when the blow would not only be painful, it would become fatal for their parasitic existence. And that moment has come. I knew that their only weakness was money. They didn't want to work. They didn't want to take responsibility. They were used to the fact that I paid all the expenses, and, most importantly, they didn't even think about the fact that one day this flow might run out. So when the next month came and the utility bills weren't paid and there was no more money on the credit cards, the house started to panic. At first it looked like a common misunderstanding. My mother-in-law asked several times why the electricity bill had not been received, to which I innocently shrugged my shoulders and said that perhaps the bank had made a mistake. Then Stephen's sister discovered that she couldn't make another online purchase, and she screamed in the house. She couldn't hide her annoyance, saying that something was wrong with my card. But the most interesting moment was the day when Stephen realized that his favorite way of living at someone else's expense, no longer worked. He came into the bedroom with an expression of irritated bewilderment on his face, threw a letter from the bank in front of me and said in a cold, threatening tone, "What does this mean?" I slowly raised my eyes, pretending that I had just looked up from reading, and looked at the document with polite curiosity. Oh, I think it's a notice of account closure, I said with such indifference that I was surprised at how easy it was for me. Notice of closure? He repeated, clenching his fists. Have you closed our account? No, I paused, enjoying his confusion, and then added, I've closed my accounts. Are you kidding? His voice cracked into an angry laugh. Not at all. I slowly folded my hands in my lap and met his gaze. It seemed to me that you've been considering me a burden for a long time, haven't you? So why do you need my money? Stephen paled. Is this some kind of stupid revenge? Do you understand that we have nothing to live on without this money? You don't have to, I clarified. That's enough for me. At that moment, his mother looked in the door, her face expressing a mixture of anxiety and indignation. What's going on? What is it? She asked. Your sister-in-law is crazy, Stephen said, still glaring at me. She closed all the accounts, and now we're in total shit. I smiled. No, dear. Now you're in total shit. There was silence in the room. At first they thought they could persuade me to change my mind, then they started demanding, threatening, blackmailing, but I just stood in front of them, silently enjoying how their world, which they had so diligently built on my resources, was collapsing. You can't just kick us out. Stephen's sister screamed, but I looked at her calmly and took out the official eviction notice from my pocket, which my lawyer had prepared in advance. I can, I replied, handing them the papers. Stephen snatched them out of my hands, ran his eyes over the text, and abruptly paled. You can't do this, he repeated, but his voice was no longer so confident. Did you think I'd let you stay here forever? I raised my eyebrows. Did you think that's how I'd pay all your bills? Congratulations, Stephen, you've finally faced reality. He looked at me with an expression like he was seeing me for the first time. And maybe it was. Because that naive girl, whom he could so easily deceive and subjugate, no longer existed. I felt an icy calmness spreading inside me, replacing anger, resentment, disappointment, all those feelings that had been tormenting me for months. Stephen screamed, his voice rising to hysterical notes, while his mother and sister, hearing the noise, hurried into the room, their faces expressing concern, but not for me, not for our relationship, but for the fact that I finally showed that I was no longer going to be comfortable and submissive. A residence permit? Are you right? I grinned, crossing my arms over my chest and staring at him. Remind me, please, what rights do people have who live in someone else's apartment without my consent? Stephen's sister flushed, straightening up indignantly. We are not strangers. We are a family. Family? I echoed, raising my eyebrows. What an interesting concept. It's funny that I've only found out about this now, when it comes to property and money. My mother-in-law stepped forward, her face tense, but a shadow of fear flashed in her eyes. For the first time in all these months, she saw in me not a victim, but an opponent, equal, if not superior to her in cold calculation. Listen, girl, she began, in a deliberately soft voice. You do understand that no one wants to quarrel. We just live here as one family, and now you suddenly decide to kick us out? This is wrong. I nodded slowly, feigning thoughtfulness. You're right. This is really wrong. It is wrong that I have allowed you to live at my expense all this time. It is wrong that you have treated me like a servant. It is wrong that I have endured this for so long. But you know what's most interesting? I no longer intend to do what is wrong for me. Stephen clenched his fists, his lips curled into a furious grimace. Do you think you're that smart? Do you think you can just throw us out of here? He took a step closer to me, his face just a few centimeters from mine. I have the rights to this apartment. I looked at him with a sneer. Really? And what are they? He froze, apparently realizing that he didn't really have anything. The apartment belonged to me. We didn't sign a prenuptial agreement that would give him a share in the property. He didn't invest a single penny in it. I lived here. He blurted out, as if that would make a difference. I took the apartment documents out of my desk drawer and slowly unfolded them in front of him. In whose name is the property registered? I paused, waiting for him to read it himself. Who paid for the utilities? Who bought the furniture? Who covered all expenses every month, including those that you considered your own? His face turned gray. Stephen's sister, realizing what was going on, rushed to the attack. This is despicable. Stop it, she hissed. You just took advantage of the fact that we didn't have the money to take over Stephen's share. I couldn't help but smile. So, in your opinion, if a person cannot afford housing, he has the right to demand it from someone who can? Interesting logic. The mother-in-law pressed her lips into a thin line. Her gaze was full of hatred, but even she understood that their positions were weak. Stephen was breathing heavily. He wasn't prepared for this turn of events. He always considered me soft, pliable, and comfortable. But now this was not the same girl who had once looked into his eyes with delight, believing every word he said. Now there was a woman standing in front of him who no longer allowed herself to be taken advantage of. You're making a big mistake, he hissed. I shrugged my shoulders. Maybe. But, I'm willing to take the risk. I took my phone out of my pocket and, pressing a few buttons, activated the speakerphone. Hello, is this the police? Yes, I have people living in my apartment who refuse to move out after being notified of eviction. No, they are not registered here. Yes, I have all the documents confirming that the apartment belongs to me. At that moment, I saw the scales fall from Stephen's eyes. He realized that he had lost. You wouldn't dare, he said hoarsely. You've already dared, I smiled. The voice of the attendant came on the line. Stay where you are, the squad will be sent to the specified address. I turned off the call and looked at the people I had been putting up with in my house for so long. You have 10 minutes to start packing. Stephen's sister screamed, rushed to her room, and her mother-in-law looked around in confusion, as if hoping that a miracle was about to happen. Stephen stood motionless, his eyes darting, but he couldn't think of any way out. He lost. And at that moment, I felt the weight that I had been carrying all these years lift from my shoulders. I found myself again. His silence lasted for several seconds, and I could almost imagine Stephen clutching his phone in his hand at that moment, barely suppressing his rage at the realization that all his clever plans were crumbling right in front of his eyes. Finally, he forced it out through his teeth. It's not fair. I couldn't help but chuckle, shaking my head even though he couldn't see it. Unfair? I repeated slowly, savoring the word. What about the fact that over the past few years I've been dragging you and your family down while you've been using my money, my house, and even my patience, believing that I should enjoy it all? Was it fair? This is different. Stop it, he shouted into the phone, but his voice shook, and I realized that he no longer believed what he was saying. We were a family, and you were supposed to take care of me. Should I? I echoed, feeling a cold fire ignite in my chest. How interesting. Have you ever thought that I have rights, desires, and needs? Or did you think that my only role was to please you and your relatives, forgetting about myself? You're just being greedy, he muttered, but without the same confidence, as if his last trump card turned out to be a faded, torn card that failed to produce the desired effect. I exhaled heavily, stifling a laugh. Greedy? Maybe, I admitted, enjoying the thought. But I like being greedy if it means that I will no longer allow myself to be convenient, use myself for the whims of others and work for free for people who don't even respect me. There was silence on the other end of the line, and I could almost hear the gears turning furiously in his head, trying to find a new way to manipulate, but he had been confident in his superiority for too long, had considered me soft and weak-willed for too long, and now, faced with the fact that I no longer played by his rules, he just didn't know what to say. "It's not over yet," he finally said. "No, Stephen," I replied calmly. "This is really the end." I hung up the call, turned off my phone, and leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes. My heart was pounding fast, but this time not from fear or humiliation, but from an incredible, intoxicating feeling of freedom. Dusk was gathering outside the window, the city was twinkling with lights, and I suddenly realized that I hadn't felt so light in a long time. For the first time in a long time, I knew that no one would dictate to me how to live anymore. No one will demand sacrifices from me, justifying it with family obligations. No one will dare to make me weak again. I opened my eyes and looked at my reflection in the mirror opposite, at a woman who had gone through hell, but came out of it stronger than ever. And that was just the beginning. Stephen couldn't contain his displeasure. His voice became more and more irritated, almost hysterical, when he realized that all his attempts to put pressure on me and manipulate me were no longer working. "Don't lie to me," he snapped furiously, and I could even imagine the corner of his mouth twitching with anger. "If you think that you can just take everything for yourself, you are deeply mistaken." I just grinned, holding the phone to my ear, but feeling neither anger nor pain anymore. "If you don't believe me, you can consult a lawyer," I replied calmly, enjoying his helplessness. "From now on, please discuss all issues only through my lawyer. I'm not going to talk to you directly anymore." I ended the conversation by turning off my phone, and at the same moment I felt as if a long-term burden had been lifted from my shoulders. For the first time in a long time, I was free from his screams, from his demands, from the constant guilt that he so artfully instilled in me. Now everything was in the hands of the lawyers, and I wasn't going to let him drag me into pointless arguments anymore. It's been a month since I left the apartment. Stephen and his family were eventually forced to move out, but not because they suddenly realized they were wrong or realized that I would not allow them to live at my expense anymore. No, the reason was much simpler. They no longer had anything to pay for their luxurious and carefree lives, because Stephen's income did not cover even half of the expenses they were used to while I naively carried this burden. I knew this would happen, and I deliberately allowed them to use the card, knowing full well that their irresponsibility would destroy them sooner or later. And now, when I blocked all accounts, when all their privileges disappeared in one moment, chaos began. Stephen's family first demanded money from him, then began stealing from his wallet, and when he realized that he was also left without funds, they accused him of driving them to such a state. Even this, in their eyes, was not their own greed, not their parasitic lifestyle, but someone else's fault. The irony of the situation reached its climax when electricity, gas, and water were turned off in the apartment. Of course, it was my merit, because the apartment was registered in my name, and I refused to pay for the comforts of those who betrayed me. The summer heat made their lives unbearable, and after a few days they began to scatter, some to distant relatives, some to friends, some simply disappeared, hoping for a better future. I didn't know and didn't want to know where they had gone. I was no longer interested in their fate. Stephen held out the longest, but even he eventually gave up. Unable to even wash properly or cook his own food, he was the last to leave the apartment, proudly defending his right to it to the last, but even he couldn't fight the reality that I was no longer there, the one who provided him with comfort and coziness. The divorce went faster than I expected. And not because Stephen suddenly changed his mind about fighting for his share, but because his carelessness played against him. He cheated on me long before we officially ended our marriage, and it became known exactly when I needed it the most. My lawyer, with undisguised satisfaction, handed me the documents, from which it became clear that Stephen, even before our breakup, had spent money from the common account on his new passion, a young, self-confident woman who obviously thought that he would become a reliable support for her. But she didn't understand that a man who betrayed her once would betray her again. I felt a strange feeling, not anger, not pain, but rather relief. It was as if another mask he had been hiding behind had collapsed, leaving only emptiness. I no longer saw in him the person I once loved. In front of me stood a pathetic, deceitful man who does not know how to value love, trust, or even his own life. After the court made the final decision, I left the building, breathed in the cool autumn air and, for the first time in a long time, felt truly free. There was no hatred left, no thirst for revenge. I knew that it wasn't me who would punish him, but life itself. 2 weeks after the divorce, I got a call from an unknown number. "Hi," came the voice that had once been so familiar to me, but now seemed alien. "What do you want, Stephen?" I asked coldly. I want to talk." His voice trembled, as if it was difficult for him to admit that he was no longer in control of the situation. "We have nothing more to talk about." "I have nowhere to live," he blurted out, and I felt the corners of my lips twitch in a grin. "What a pity," I replied calmly. "Good luck." I turned off the call and laughed. It was finally over. Stephen boasted about his new life, loudly declaring to everyone who was willing to listen that now he was finally freed from the yoke of family shackles and living the way he always dreamed of, in a luxurious apartment in the city center, surrounded by young women, whom he taught with an important air the intricacies of a successful life, assuring them that it was only thanks to him that they could understand what true comfort, style, and pleasure were. One thing that surprised me was how you could lead such a lifestyle with a family that had recently been dependent on you without feeling the slightest remorse. But apparently in his case it was more a pattern than an exception, because his loved ones have long been accustomed to such behavior and did not consider it reprehensible, preferring to turn a blind eye to the obvious and justify it all by saying that Stephen provides for them financially. Their moral principles have long become flexible, adapting to his convenience, and no one even tried to think about the fact that their entire habitual life was based on lies, manipulation, and my money. But what Stephen never understood and obviously didn't want to understand is that I'm not the weak and submissive woman he always thought I was. I'm not the one who meekly agrees to his rules, suffers humiliation, and accepts his demands, afraid of losing what has been for a long time. It became just an illusion of a family. Even before I left our house, I installed cameras in key areas of the apartment, anticipating that he would try to distort the truth and present me in the most unfavorable light. And now I had not just words or guesses, but irrefutable evidence: his infidelities, his lies, his cynical attempts to make me look like a victim, his financial machinations with the family card, which he committed without considering it necessary to hide. Stephen was sure that I would put up with everything, but when I put all the facts in front of him, when I calmly, restrainedly, without the slightest manifestation of the emotions that he would so like to see, anger, hysteria, tears, voiced to him everything that I now know, for the first time in my life I saw in his eyes not self-confidence and not ridicule, but fear. For the first time, he realized how deeply he had sunk into his own mistakes, how recklessly he had lived believing that I would never dare to fight back. I demanded huge alimony payments, compensation for all the years I had spent next to him, suffering humiliation, deception and betrayal, and when his lawyer saw the amount I indicated, Stephen literally turned pale, his fingers convulsively gripped the edges of the table, and his eyes darted around the room, as if he was looking for a way out that was not there. It existed. He started begging me for reconciliation, for a second chance, muttering something about how we could start all over again, that he had changed, that he realized his mistakes, but I could no longer and did not want to listen to this play in which he tried his best to play a repentant husband. How can you go back to a man who betrayed you over and over again, who humiliated you, robbed you of your strength, drained every last drop out of you, and now that he no longer needs you, he's trying to get you back just because it benefits him? I knew that Stephen didn't have the ability to pay the entire amount at once, and it was even to my advantage. I forced him to take out loans, drive himself into debt, borrow money from his company, making him feel on his own skin what it means to live in constant fear of financial ruin. He tried to find a loophole, tried to get out, but the threat of legal action for card fraud forced him to sign everything I demanded. I had cornered him, just as he had cornered me for years, and now that he was completely broken, I took everything I could. The divorce process was completed, and now I had legal confirmation that it was over. I stayed with my grandparents. It was a temporary step, but for the first time in a long time I felt safe. They were always there for me, they supported me when it seemed to me that I couldn't take it anymore, and it was thanks to them that I began to regain my strength, to regain myself. I haven't decided what to do with the apartment yet. It meant a lot to me, because it was an inheritance from my parents, their last gift to me, but they left when I was too young to remember them, and now, after everything that happened, I thought maybe they would understand if I decided to let this place go. Sometimes you need to leave the past behind in order to allow yourself to step into the future. My work has finally started to gain momentum. I have long dreamed of becoming a successful illustrator, and now I had the opportunity to focus on what brought me not only money, but also real pleasure. Maybe soon I would be living alone again, and that no longer scared me. On the contrary, I felt that now was the moment when I could start a new chapter of my life. I needed a little more time to fully recover, and for now I was staying with my grandparents, but now I knew for sure that I would never let anyone control my life again. No one else will force me to obey, no one else will be able to manipulate me, use me for their own benefit. If I ever decide to build a relationship again, it won't be because I'm afraid of being alone, or because someone will convince me that I'm worthless without them, but because there will be someone with whom I can share my life on equal terms.